Well, here we are in session 62 this time, skipping through the do here. We're looking at something we've entitled A Telling Parable, and it's in the beginning of Mark 12, the first 12 verses. We're going to look at what Jesus did as chapter 12 begins, chapter 11 ends. He gave the leaders of the Sanhedrin a look they never wanted to see. He's going to tell a parable, but they will understand this parable, but they won't like it one bit. Mark 12, verse 1. And he, Jesus, began to speak to them, the leaders who had just challenged his authority, leaders from the Sanhedrin. He began to speak to them in parables, at least one parable. It goes something like this. A man planted a vineyard and put a wall around it and dug a vat under the winepress and built a tower. We'll speak about what those things are and what they mean in a bit. And he rented it out to vine growers. In other words, this man was not going to do the work himself. As a matter of fact, he was going to be an absentee landlord. Because what does it finish saying in verse 1? And he, the owner, went on a journey. And this was going to be a fairly long journey. And when we pick it up, we may be in the 5th year even of this journey. We're not sure about that, but we're somewhere along the line in this man's journey. He goes and he does not come back during this parable. So he's going to be gone the whole time. There are a number of details in this open line that's not quite, that makes it a parable, not quite like the others. First of all, is because what's different is that his opposition does understand it. He intended for them to understand it so they would know where he was coming from. And by the way, by the telling of this parable, he also tells them where his authority comes from. Not directly, but it's easily inferred from the parable. So, let's take a look at it. First, this parable will uncharacteristically, how many syllables is that? It will uncharacteristically be understood by these opponents who are standing in front of him. The man in the parable is a question about it. Is he a Jew or a Gentile? We're not told. I think we tend to assume he was a Jew, but we don't know that. The man started a vineyard and did it in very good fashion. He built this vineyard properly. Then, once he had finished it, he made a contract with some tenant vine dressers. He made a sharing contract, a produce sharing. In other words, when you harvest grapes from this vineyard, the owner would get a certain percentage, the vine growers would get the rest. And then the guy leaves, the owner leaves for some evidently long time period. Again, we said we don't know. It's somewhere from 0 to 5 years, we would assume. And we'll talk about that in a bit. And just sure we are up to speed. Let's look at the details of the man's vineyard building effort. He planted vines, which normally, and here's where we get our 5 years, would normally take 5 years to begin to produce grapes. But he would planted vines. If he's going to all this trouble, he probably planted good vines. He provided protection for the vineyard by a wall. What was the purpose of the wall? To keep out both wild animals and human intruders. He installed a wine press. That's part of the harvest process, right? And he dug a pit under it to hold the grape juice flowing from the wine press. So he set everything up. He built a tower in the middle of the vineyard. Why? What was the purpose of the tower? Well, it provided added protection by acting as a vantage point for a watchman. He could see what was going on all around. And the tower also provided lodging for anyone working there. They could sleep in this building, this tower. And the tower also provided for storage area that would, or storage that would be needed by the vine dressers, seeds, other tools, different kinds of things would need to be stored somewhere, and this tower would serve that purpose. He then provided for the care of the vineyards by making this contract with tenant vine dressers. The contract included an understanding or agreement of the responsibility for caring for the welfare of the vineyard. I'm sure that was part of it. He's not going to turn it over to somebody who just sit there and look at it. They have to take care of it so that it will live up to its ability to produce grapes. And it'll be the agreement, they had to have an agreement on the percentages of sharing. How much of the harvest goes to the owner, how much of the harvest goes to the vine dresser. And since the owner has made this investment, he would expect a reasonable return on his investment. Who got what percentages of the fruits of the harvest? That was part of it. So, then the man left. He became, and as I mentioned earlier, absentee landlord. Many people feel that he was, in fact, a foreigner, most likely a Gentile. But he owned this land, at least until Jubilee, right? Okay. So what's the first point which one looks for to see how the parable plays out? Well, at the first harvest, you would think. That's the first time that, unless these guys are defective in their care for the vineyard, and that's not in their interest to do that, at the first harvest, they would have to come and divvy up the proceeds from the fruit of the vine. That may occur again, as we said, up to 5 years from the time of the contract. So, where in that 5-year period was the vineyard when the owner made this contract and left? We don't know. We're not told. That's not the point. The question is, what happened at that first harvest? Mark 12:2 begins to tell us. At the harvest time, he, the owner, sent a slave to the vine growers. Why? In order to receive some of the produce of the vineyard from the vine growers. In other words, he sent a slave to get his cut of the take. Okay? The owner sends one of his employees to go check the vineyard and the harvest and collect the owner's share from those vine dressers. But what was the response of the vine dressers? And they took him, the owner's servant, and beat him and sent him away empty-handed. The tenant vine growers were not nice guys. They mistreated the servant, they beat him, they sent him away with a message, no payoff for the owner. And the owner's response, that would be next, right? Verse 4, and again the owner, sent them, the vine dressers, tenants, another slave, and they wounded him in the head and treated him shamefully. Again, the servant sent was mistreated, apparently beaten worse than the first was. But the same result, the message, no take for the owner. And one supposes that the guy was sent back without any payment or produce from the harvest. The produce could have been in kind, or it could have been cash. We don't know which was most likely. The owner's response at this new rejection, this is like a volleyball game or badminton game. Serve, return, back, forth. And so, verse 5, the owner sent another. And that one they killed. Number 3 didn't come home. And so with many others, beating some and killing others. So these guys, these tenant vine dressers, were violent men, doing everything they could to ensure they kept 100% of the fruit of the vine. The violent response increases all the way to the point of homicide. So far, what? 2 servants beaten, a third killed. Matthew says that he was stoned in Matthew 21:35. And so on, apparently through all the servants the owner had. Matthew said the owner sent groups of servants even. But the same thing always happened. What was left after there was no sharing of the profits? Verse 6. He, the owner, had one more he could send, a beloved son. Does this begin to sound familiar now? Because this is a parable. We're going to talk about what it means in a minute. He sent him, the son, last of all to them, that is the tenants, saying, they will respect my son. Won't they? That's not part of Scripture. There won't be, but the assumption the guy says, they'll surely respect my son. They may not have respect for my servants and my employees, but they'll certainly respect my son. Notice the son has never entered into this before. Whether the tenants had ever met his son or not, we don't know. I'm going to assume that they had met the son, and I'll show why in a minute. Why the owner thought that the tenants would respect his son when they had not respected any of his other messengers, any of the other guys he sent. Why would these guys respect his son? Why did he think that? We don't know. A minor question arises. How would the tenant farmers recognize the owner's son? This is a question I mentioned a minute ago. Had they met him? during the original dealings with the owner? We're not told. We have no idea how they would have recognized the son. Or would he have to have come to them and told, look, I'm the guy's son. It's got to stop, and on and on. We're not told, but we do, but recognize the son they did somehow, some way, shape, and form. Verse 7. But those vine growers said to one another, this is the heir. They knew he was the son. Come, let's kill him, and the inheritance will be ours. That decision and their reasoning that they could grab the vineyards as their own seems absurd to us today, but it wasn't absurd to them. Let me tell you how they may have reasoned. Or did they? Did they reason at all? We don't know. But they may have reasoned. Look, the owner didn't come himself. If they killed all his servants that they sent, he would next come himself. But he didn't. He sent his son. So kill the heir, and there will be none to claim the vineyard, was what they probably thought. If we kill the heir and the old man is dead, then there is no owner available to claim this vineyard. And according to law, in that day, in that time, in that culture, the first to occupy the vineyard, by law, the first claimants will be the new owners. This perhaps was what their reason was. We don't know precisely. But we do know that seemingly what they were looking for was to get out of the harvest sharing. That's what they've been doing the whole time, killing people who wanted to collect. Say, you're not going to collect. You're not going to collect. You're not going to collect. The owner was told over and over again, no, you're not going to collect. Well, they definitely did not want to share the fruits of the vineyard. The logic of their thoughts was legally correct in that culture and that time. So, what do we see in Mark 12:8? And they took him, the son, and killed him, and threw him out of the vineyard. Now notice, Mark has it that they killed him and threw him out, as if it's killed him and then threw him out. Mark doesn't say then, but it looks like he's claiming they killed him inside the vineyard, threw him out of the vineyard. The parable ends that way. Jesus wasn't finished yet, but the parable is over. But let me inject a point here from Matthew and from Luke as they describe this parable. Matthew 21:39. And they, that's the tenants, took him, the son, and threw him out of the vineyard and killed him. Now it looks that Matthew has said they threw him out first and killed him outside the vineyard. He didn't say it that way, but that's what you would suspect. And Luke 20:15, first part of it, and they, the tenants, threw him, the son, out of the vineyard and killed him. So Luke is saying it much as Matthew did, and implying that the son was tossed out of the vineyard and then killed. So both of them have the son killed outside the vineyard. Mark seemingly has him killed inside the vineyard. I'm not sure what to make of this, except that it's a detail in a parable, and details are not generally of great significance within a parable. But consider this for a minute. Jesus was crucified outside Jerusalem or inside? He was taken outside and crucified outside. So from the inside of Jerusalem, Jesus was taken outside and executed. But look at it this way too. Jesus was crucified inside Israel. He wasn't taken out of Israel until his ascension. So, make of that what you will. I'm not sure what you can make of it, except some people will say that like Christ was executed outside of Jerusalem, the Son was executed outside of the vineyard. I don't know whether that was intended as part of this or not. That's stretching the details a bit. Now, back to Jesus' wind-up of the parable, as he, according to Mark, asks a rhetorical question, and then he answers it. What will the owner of the vineyard do? Because remember, the owner's not dead. Those guys may have thought he was dead, but he's not. Then Jesus answers his own question. I think the people would have answered the same way. As a matter of fact, we'll see in a minute that either Matthew or Luke says it, that the people said this. And remember, part of the people there were the ones from the Sanhedrin. In Mark it says, he will come, the owner, and destroy the vine growers. He's going to kill them. And will give the vineyard to others. We're going to look at what all this means in a few minutes. Luke adds some response from those who were listening, which, remember, included the religious leaders who had attempted to challenge Jesus' authority. Luke 20:16. And this is Jesus speaking. He will come and destroy those vine growers, and will give the vineyard to others. And when they, those listening, heard it, they said, may it never be. Because who was he going to give the vineyard to? Not to the people who had previously managed the vineyard. He was going to give them to someone else, maybe even foreigners. Luke's response from the listener certainly sounds like it came, partially at least, from the religious leaders who had tried to challenge Jesus. Matthew gives a slight different ending thought, that the listeners answered Jesus' rhetorical question. And that's entirely possible. If the listeners answered Jesus' rhetorical question, then he could have answered it and repeated what they said, so that both said the same thing. But let's look at Matthew 21:41. They, those listening by, said to him, Jesus, he, the owner, will bring those wretches to a wretched end. He's going to bump them off. And will rent out the vineyard to other vine growers. He'll find new people to manage his vineyard, who will pay him the proceeds at the proper seasons. Everyone seems to have grasped the idea of the justice required at the end of the parable. What's the justice? You take a human life, you owe your own life. Except perhaps for the religious leaders who would have rejected the transfer of ownership, or at least tenants' rights, of the vineyard. We'll see about that in a minute. Think what you just seen in this parable. The vineyard, Israel. Old Testament, it was fairly typical. The tenant vine growers were the religious leaders of Israel, some of those standing by and listening to this parable. The vineyard owner is Yahweh, who established Israel and blessed her to make her who she was to be for him, just like the owner built the vineyard to produce fruit for him. The owner's son, that's clearly Jesus, whom the religious leaders were just days away from killing. The Gentiles and the church are those to whom God will transfer the care of his people. Did the religious leaders get the point of the parable? Ain't no question about it. Jesus abruptly then changed focus from vineyard to stone. He didn't really change the point, but he changed the nature of the discussion. Mark 12:10. Have you not even read this scripture? The stone which the builders rejected. The builders, of course, would be the hierarchy of Judaism. They rejected Jesus. This same stone, it just says this, but it means the same stone, became the chief cornerstone. God select Jesus as the chief cornerstone of his building, which is the church. This came about from the Yahweh, and it is marvelous in our eyes. The subject, of course, hasn't really changed. The builder is Yahweh, the stone is Jesus. Builders that rejected the stone are the religious leaders. The builders rejected Jesus, but Yahweh chose him to be the most important stone in his house, the church. The quote, by the way, is from Psalm 118, verses 22 and 23. And Psalm 118 is a recognized messianic psalm. Things wound up with the religious elite frustrated. Let's look at verse 12. And they, the religious elite, were seeking to seize him, arrest him, if you please. And yet they fear the multitude, because the multitude was hanging on every word. They loved what he was saying. They didn't know what would happen if they tried to arrest Jesus in front of them. For they, the multitude, understand that Jesus spoke the parable against, and they feared the multitude, for they, and that's not the multitude, the they here is those religious leaders who were hearing all of this, understood that Jesus spoke the parable against them. They knew who he was, who Yahweh was, who Israel was, and who they were. And so they left him and went away. They wanted to arrest him, but they didn't, because they didn't know what the people would do. So they went away, leaving Jesus free to walk away. They understood the parable all right. They understood the case against him. But they also feared that those who followed Jesus, if only out of curiosity, and so they knew that those who followed Jesus They didn't know what they could or would do if they tried to arrest him at that moment. They walked away in disgust, I'm sure, while Jesus continued or remained free for the moment. Next session, we're going to move from the Sanhedrin's attempt to challenge Jesus to an old alliance of Pharisees and Herodians try to trap Jesus into something they could use against him. We go clear back to what, Mark 3 or somewhere between 3 and 6. We were told that the Pharisees and the Herodians went together to conspire to kill him, find a way to kill him anyhow. Well, whatever they're trying to do now is not going to work, but we'll see how and why that's true next time.